I guess I will get started on time. So welcome and good afternoon. And thank you for joining us for the Florida JCC's monthly book and author series, which we have been bringing to you since last May. Very hard to believe that it has been almost a year that we have collaborated together with the 6 JCCs of Florida. So thank you to all of you who have been tuning in every month, and a warm welcome to those tuning in for the first time with us today. This series is brought to you in partnership with 6 JCCs in Florida, the Alpert JCC in South Miami, the Galbert Family JCC in Miami Beach, the Adolph and Rose Levis JCC in Boca Raton, the David Pasternack JCC in Fort Lauderdale, the Roth JCC in Orlando, and the Michael Ann Russell JCC in North Miami Beach. I'm Karen Sepsenwall. I'm the Director of Cultural Arts at the Galbert Family Miami Beach JCC on the Simpkins Family Campus. And I want to say Happy Women's History Month to everybody. Today, we are fortunate to have with us Janice Kaplan, the author of The Genius of Women, an important book for us all to read and understand the rigged system that has led 90% of the Americans to falsely believe that geniuses are almost always men. It is time to change this narrative, and Janice Kaplan will tell us how. Janice has enjoyed wide success as a magazine editor, television producer, writer, and journalist. She is the former editor-in-chief of Parade magazine and the author of the New York Times bestsellers, The Gratitude Diaries, and I'll See You Again, among many other books that she has written and co-authored. And today, Janice will be joined by Susan Gladstone Pasternack, who is the executive director of the Jewish Museum of Florida, FIU. Susan has served in several prominent leadership positions in the US and abroad, most recently as the director of development for the museum and for all of FIU's Jewish strategic initiatives, including the university's Global Jewish Studies program, Holocaust Studies, and Hillel FIU. Her career has led to excel at the highest levels of expertise in creating and managing multi-million-dollar budgets, fundraising, and the cultivation of sponsorship donors and major gifts. We will be taking your questions throughout the program, so please use the Q&A function on the bottom of your screen, or you can also use the chat, and we will get to as many as time allows. Also, a reminder that you can purchase The Genius of Women by visiting your local bookstore, Books and Books, or the Writer's Block. So now please welcome to your screen, Janice Kaplan and Susan Gladstone Pasternack. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Karen. It's such a pleasure to be here with people from all of the 6 JCCs. What a wonderful idea. And I'm very honored to be able to be in conversation with Janice today. I know, Janice, that you have a PowerPoint for us to look at, but before we do, could you just tell us a few words about yourself and what motivated you to write this book?
Sure. Thanks so much. And thank you, Karen. And wonderful to be with all of you. Again, I'm in New York, so I really wish I were with all of you down there in Florida, though it is sunny today in New York. So Susan, I have thought about women's issues for much of my career and have been interested in them in so many of the books that I've written in different ways. This specific book, I had been thinking about some of the structural problems that we face, and we know we face them, right? We hear about them all the time. We see them, we understand the obstacles. But many of you know me from my previous book, The Gratitude Diaries. So you know I tend to look at the world in a very positive way. And so I started thinking about these issues in a positive way too. And I started wondering how it is that despite all of the obstacles in their way, some women in every generation have managed to achieve so much and soar so high. And I wondered what it is that we can learn from them to let our own talents shine more and the talents of our children and our grandchildren. And Karen referenced the 90% of Americans who think that geniuses tend to be men. That was a survey that was done by a friend of mine named Mike Berland, who's a well-known strategist and pollster. And Mike came to me when he had done that survey and he told me about it. And he was shocked by that number. I mean, we've just had an election. You know that 90% of Americans do not agree on anything. And when asked to name a female genius, virtually the only person anybody could come up with was Marie Curie. So he said to me, "What do you think is going on?" And I pretty much had no idea, but I decided to spend the next 2 years coming up with an answer for him.
That's terrific. So I'm very eager to see your presentation that you have for us. So why don't we do that? And then we'll have a discussion afterwards.
Sounds great. Thank you. But before I get into that, let me just say that I guess the first question people probably have is about how I defined genius. The book is called The Genius of Women. And I defined it very openly. I was really just talking about women who have extraordinary talent, women who have done good things. And I learned very, very early on that virtually all of the definitions of genius that we have used, including IQ, are pretty meaningless and really have no effect on how people function in the real world. Probably the best definition I came up with was from a professor at Cambridge University. I started my research by going to London, and he said to me that he thinks of genius as the place where extraordinary talent meets celebrity. And I was really taken aback by that, meets celebrity. This was an old school academic. This was not a guy who, knows who the Kardashians are or cares about Tom Hanks. And what he meant, though, was not celebrity in a Hollywood way, but celebrity in the sense of getting your work noticed. And no matter what field you're in, no matter what field you've been in, you know that there are a lot of people who do great work, but not all of that work gets noticed. And for too long, and probably up until this very minute, most women throughout the generations have had just one half of that equation. They've had the extraordinary talent, but they haven't had the attention, the notice, the celebrity. And if you don't have that, your work can't have an impact in that generation or in future ones. As an example of that, let me just share my screen with you here and tell you the story of a Jewish woman from back in the 1930s named Lise Meitner. Now, Lise Meitner had an amazing discovery. She was one of the key people in the discovery of nuclear fission. Nuclear fission is kind of a big deal, and it won the Nobel Prize. I say it won the Nobel Prize because Lise Meitner did not. It went to her lab partner, a man named Otto Hahn. Now, from what I understand, Otto Hahn was a very nice man and a very good chemist, and maybe he even deserved to win the Nobel Prize for something else, but not for nuclear fission, which he didn't really understand. But the men on the Nobel Committee, and they were men at that time, could not wrap their heads around the idea that a woman could have made this kind of discovery. So they fell back on the old idea of the woman behind the man, and they gave the prize to the man. So what's going on here? Well, I guess we could call it old-fashioned misogyny. And believe me, I don't rule that out. But I think it's probably something subtler, which psychologists refer to as confirmation bias. And what that means is that when you already believe something, when you have an idea about something, and again, we see this in politics all the time, you look for the information that's going to support what you already believe. And when you hear something that doesn't fit in with that, you kind of discard it. And we do that with men and women also. We have our ideas of what men and women are supposed to do, what they can do, how they're supposed to function. And we tend to have stereotypes about them, right? Maybe we've discarded the old stereotype of the woman behind the man, but we just replace them with new ones. Now, okay, here we are, we're a bunch of smart Jewish women from all over. And you're going, yeah, I understand about confirmation bias. I've heard about implicit bias. I know all of that, but it doesn't affect me. I'm too smart for that. I don't fall into that. Well, let me tell you a story about myself that might help to shed light on how we all fall into that. Early in my research, I was interviewing a woman named Jo Dunkley, who is a tenured professor of physics at Princeton. I knew she had been hired away from Oxford, where she was a tenured professor of physics at Oxford. And I really wanted to do well in this interview. I didn't know that much about her subject, so I studied up and I wanted to be prepared. And I got down to Princeton and I knocked on her door. And I realized that I wasn't prepared at all. Now, if when I said a tenured professor of physics at Princeton, what you pictured is the very attractive young woman on the left, I congratulate you, because I realized that even though I knew who she was somewhere in the back of my head, I expected her to look like Albert Einstein. The idea that women geniuses will look like Albert Einstein runs very deep and starts very early. There's another professor at Princeton named Sarah Jane Leslie who did a wonderful experiment where she invited young children into her lab, and she told them a story about somebody who was very, very smart. And then she showed them 4 pictures, 2 of men and 2 of women. And she asked them, who is the very, very smart person? Well, up to age 5, all of the children picked somebody who looked just like them. The boys picked one of the men and the girls picked one of the women. At age 6, it changed. And at that point, the boys picked one of the men and the girls picked one of the men. Leslie said to me that she wasn't sure what had changed at age 6, other than that the social messages that we're sending kids start to be heard very deeply. Kids don't always realize, or parents don't always realize those messages that are in the air, but kids are really smart and they're picking them up and they're hearing who we expect to be the smart people, who we have in our TV shows as the smart people. And more often than not, it's men rather than women. Another story that struck me and why it is so important for us to understand this is to realize what happens to women when they're put in that position. So back in the early 1800s, again in Berlin, again, a nice Jewish woman named Fannie Mendelson. And she was the sister of Felix Mendelssohn, the composer, who I'm sure you've all heard of. They played together, they played their music together when they were young, and Fannie was said to be more talented than Felix. And they performed and she was amazing. But then when she was 14 years old, her father, Abraham Mendelssohn, wrote her a letter. And he told her that it was time for her to go home, to learn some needlework and to get married. And he said, for a woman, music is just to be an ornament. It can't be the root of your being. I always find that so sad to even say those words out loud, because music was the root of her being. And can you imagine telling a man that he had to go home and get married and he couldn't do what he most loved? He'd say, why can't I do both? Well, one of the things I learned from Fannie Mendelson is not just that things were tough, but what I started out by saying about how some women did manage to achieve. And I think what women have always learned to do is what I've started to think of as the great workaround, to realize what the problems are at the time and figure out how they're going to work around them. So one of the things Fannie Mendelson did is she did go home, she did get married, but as I said, she was a rich Jewish lady. She had a big house in Berlin. She would invite 200 people over to her house on a Sunday afternoon and play the music for them because it was a private concert. It wasn't considered scandalous. And she continued composing. She composed some 400 songs, and many of them she published under Felix's name. Now, Felix said he was doing her a great favor because it would be such a scandal if a woman published under her own name. I say, beware of men who say they are protecting you. It was a pretty good deal for Felix. He got invited to Buckingham Palace once, and Queen Victoria said she had invited him because he had written her very favorite song. What could he say? He knew Fannie had written it. Doing that great workaround is something we do up to now. We have to continue doing that. Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who we sadly lost in the last year, understood the need for doing the great workaround in her time also. And when she was applying to Harvard Law School, the dean of Harvard Law School asked her why she should be allowed to take a place that would normally go to a man. Now, the obvious answer should have been because I'm smarter than most of the men, but she knew that wasn't going to work so well. So she said, well, she wanted to be able to support her husband, Marty, in his law and understand what he was doing. She probably felt a little nauseous in saying that, but hey, it was the workaround. She got into Harvard Law School and we know what happened after that. She also was smart enough to do that great workaround as she was bringing her early gender discrimination cases. Many of the cases she brought in those early days, the plaintiffs were a man, because she wanted to point out that gender discrimination is as bad for men as it is for women. When I was a little girl, I was about 8 years old, and I went to the doctor with my mom, and the doctor told my mom that he thought I was reading too much. My mom got really worried and she said, is there something wrong with her eyes? And the doctor said, no, the eyes are fine. but a girl can be too smart for her own good. Now, I bet a lot of you heard things like that when you were growing up. And up until then, I thought being smart was a really good thing. It's what I had gotten a lot of credit for, but my mom seemed to understand exactly what that doctor meant. Now, most of us would never say anything like that to a little girl anymore. We don't tell little girls that they can be too smart for their own good. But I worry because we say it to them in 1,000 different ways. When I was writing this book, there was a big resurgence in The Little Mermaid. I think Disney was doing a live action remake of it. And there were lots of little girls on one particular Halloween dressing up as Ariel and knocking on our door. May I remind you the story of The Little Mermaid? Ariel needs to get the kiss of true love from Eric, Prince Eric, in order to live on land and be happy. And in order to do that, she gives up her voice and she becomes mute. What better way do we have of telling little girls that they should shut up and look pretty? I was telling this story the other day and somebody told me that Meghan Markle actually said it in her Oprah interview. I didn't watch that, but that was the message that little girls were hearing and that we continue to say to them up till now. Now, I don't think that any parents or grandparents who put their daughters in cute little princess costumes or buy them those Ariel backpacks mean to be sending those messages. But once again, the kids are picking them up. Now, I know kids get a lot of social benefit by fitting in, looking pretty, doing the things that society expects them to do. And I don't think we can necessarily take that away from them. And I don't suggest that we do. But what we can do is try really hard to balance it out. If your daughter wants to dress up as a princess, let her, but then show her some footage from the Mars rover landing last week and get excited about that. Kids will get excited about what you're excited about. And you know what? Their talents are much more likely to shine if they're excited about being astronauts and dreaming about space than if they are about dreaming about being a princess. Cynthia Brazil, who's one of the amazing women I interviewed for this book, said that she thinks we live in an age of 1,000 nudges. As I said, we don't tell little girls anymore that they're too smart for their own good, but we push them in different directions. And often those directions are away from the things where they can do the most good in science or math. And we don't because we don't expect them to function well, they simply don't. I think you might pause when I say if we don't expect them to function well, they won't, because you think, well, either you're smart or you're not, either you're a genius or you're not. Everything proves that that's not true, that the expectations we hold is what kids reach to. Another study that was done that I loved, researchers invited the parents of 11-month-old babies to come into the lab. And they had a ramp set up and they asked the parents to set the ramp as steep as they thought their baby could crawl down. The parents of the boy babies made the ramp considerably steeper than the parents of the girl babies. And when told afterwards that they had done that, all of the parents said, no, absolutely not. I would not raise my boys and girls any differently. But they had. Their expectations, their deep-seated expectations were such that they had set that ramp differently. And by the way, in case you're wondering, at age 11 months, there is absolutely no physical difference in what a baby boy or girl can do, and certainly in whether or not they can climb down a ramp at a different depth. And in fact, if you didn't put those little ribbons in their hair at 11 months, you wouldn't know which gender they were. I'm not going to talk too much about female and male brains right now, but I hope you will read the book. I have a chapter about it, and it's really quite fascinating how so many of the things that we believe about male and female brains simply aren't true. There's a researcher at Tel Aviv University named Daphne Joel who's done some wonderful research where she has looked at MRIs of thousands of male and female brains that were done in other studies. And she said that there was not one single brain she saw that she could identify as all male or all female. All of us are a mosaic of talents and abilities, and they overlap enormously. So often, as I said, the things that we think are hardwired are socially wired. I hear parents always telling me about, my 2-year-old will only wear a tutu. Well, if I said to you that at 18 months or 2 years, some children are speaking French, some children are speaking Spanish, some are speaking Hebrew, and that must mean that language is hardwired, you would look at me and you would say, "You're crazy, Janice. It means that the children are picking up the language from what they're hearing." So why is it that we can understand that? And believe me, I've tried to learn languages. It's a lot harder to learn a language than it is to know whether you're expected to wear a pink tutu or play with Legos. I think for time, I'm going to skip this one, and I'm going to go right to some of the traits that I discovered of genius women. Geniuses are by their, or smart women or exceptional women are by their very nature distinctive and unique and have their own abilities. But I interviewed so many of them that I was able to find many things that they have in common. And I'd like to share a few of those with you because, again, I think they're things that can help all of us develop our own talents and our family members' talents. The first thing I discovered was that these women had blinders to bias. And now what I mean by that is that when they were rising up in their professions, they simply didn't see the obstacles in their way. I mentioned Jo Dunkley before, and she told me that when she was an undergraduate at Oxford, she never went to the women in science meetings because she didn't see herself that way. She just saw herself as a scientist. And she never was afraid to raise her hand in class. People always talk about how girls in physics are afraid to raise their hand because the class is filled with men. She said she was never afraid because she never noticed that the class was filled with men. And once she got to the position that she is in now, she does notice, and she does try to make things easier for women who are following her. And that's extremely important. But I think, well, let me give you another example. Meg Urey, who is her counterpart at Yale, and she had been at NASA before Yale hired her away. And Meg said that when she was young, she knew what she wanted to do at NASA, but at that time, there were no women doing the kind of roles she wanted. And she told herself, "Oh, I know what it must be. It must be that no women ever wanted to do this before." And she said, looking back now, she knows that was baloney. Of course, there were women who wanted to do it before, but they just didn't know how to get through the obstacles. But for Meg, not seeing the obstacles, believing she could do it, made a huge difference. So I said at the beginning that there are structural problems that we need to change in society, and I stand strongly by that. But each of us has only one life, and each of our children only does. And sometimes being able to ignore those obstacles until you're at the place where you can do something about them matters a lot. Another commonality I found from these women was an ability to see beyond gender. I interviewed Tina Landau, who was a Broadway director and a really wonderful Broadway director. And when we spoke, she had just been nominated as for the Tony Award in directing. And she was the only woman nominated that year in directing. I imagine that's probably true in most years for the Tony Awards. And she said to me, everybody was referring to her as a woman director, and that she doesn't think of herself as a woman director. She thinks of herself as a woman who directs. It sounds like we're splitting hairs here, but it's really a huge difference. When you talk about a woman director, a woman scientist, a woman doctor, a woman artist, you're suggesting that all women are the same, and that all women are going to be doctors, lawyers, or directors in the same way. If you say you're a woman who directs, you say, "I'm a woman, that's great, love that. I'm a director, also great," but they don't have a lot to do with each other. I mentioned before how we sometimes replace old stereotypes with new ones. And I think we've done that even in a way that is damaging at the same time people mean it to be positive. I interviewed so many executives, male executives, who were trying to be supportive of my book and excited about it. And they said, yes, we need more women in top positions. We need more women on corporate boards and in companies because women are so much more cooperative and collegial than men. Well, that's the new stereotype. But are women more cooperative and collegial than men? I know some women who are cooperative and collegial. I know some men who are cooperative and collegial. I know some women who are great leaders and some men who are great leaders. And once again, it's that confirmation bias. If that's what we expect, we sort of force people into that category. It's interesting when you think about the women who were elected to Congress in 2018, some of them ran on the platform of, being women and that they could reach across the aisle. Have any of them done that? Absolutely not. There's some tough women there, but more collegial and cooperative? I don't think so. Another trait I found in virtually all of the women I interviewed was a positive approach. Now, as I said, I wrote the gratitude diaries. I see positivity everywhere. But the truth is, I never encountered a group of women who were less complaining of the problems that they had faced, and they all had faced issues. The woman you see here is Frances Arnold, who did win the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 2018. And she said when she talks to young women and talks to kids she's trying to help, she urges women to face the world in a positive and powerful way, rather than a negative and fearful one. And she said she thinks that makes all the difference. And she pointed out that, men are not the enemy. And when women say, oh, there's no women to mentor me, it's okay. Sometimes there are good guys who will mentor you. She had started her work in the field that ultimately won her the Nobel Prize about many, many decades ago. It takes a long time to win a Nobel Prize. She was a young woman when she started out, and everybody in chemistry was telling her that the idea she had, which was for how to create new enzymes and chemicals in the lab, which was totally overturning standard chemistry, everybody told her that it couldn't possibly work, that she was going in the wrong direction, and she should go back to more traditional pathways. And I said to her, how did you have the courage to keep going? And she said, I did not doubt myself. And I loved that phrase. And if I did needlework, I would needlepoint it on a pillow. Because could you imagine how much more all of us could do if we were able to say, I did not doubt myself? One additional trait that I found of so many of these women was that they had a multifaceted life. I spoke to Sian Bylock, who is the president of Barnard College, and she's also a psychology researcher. And she talked about the importance of a woman having many different selves, of not depending on just one definition of herself for everything that she does. And she described how some days she thinks that she's the worst mom in the world because she forgot to pack her 8-year-old daughter's lunch. But then she can go to work and she can have a breakthrough in the lab, or she's the president of a university, or she can talk to a colleague and she can feel good about another part of her life. We all have that, where we slip back and forth into many different roles. Men have always had that, and I think women sometimes feel guilty about it. I'm not saying it's easy, and women unfortunately have still had to figure out how to handle those many different roles on their own often, but being able to have that does make for a great richness in your life. And virtually all of the women I interviewed for this book, by the way, did have families, did have children, and they did talk about the importance of that multifaceted life. I'm going to finish here with a quick story about how things do turn to the positive sometime. Jocelyn Bell has a story similar to Lise Meitner, who I started with. She discovered pulsars back in the 1950s. Again, a big discovery. Again, as with Lise Meitner, the credit and the Nobel Prize went to a man. In her case, it was to her male advisor. Well, Jocelyn Bell was a young graduate student at the time, and she was very gracious about it. And she said, hey, that's okay. Maybe it should be, I'm just a student, maybe it should be the male advisor who gets the credit. Well, a number of years went by, 50 years, in fact, and a couple of years ago, a bunch of Silicon Valley billionaires started something called the Breakthrough Prize, which they wanted to be a competition for the Nobel Prize, and that they thought they could move faster and recognize people more quickly. And it has been an extremely important award. And they also looked back, and they gave a Breakthrough Prize to, she has now acquired a title and additional names, to Dame Jocelyn Bell Burnell for her discovery all those years ago of pulsars, which had been overlooked. And this time, Dame Jocelyn Bell Burnell was again very gracious in accepting the award. But then she turned around and she said she was going to donate every penny of the $3 million award to fighting unconscious bias against women and to helping women let their own talents in science shine. And I loved that story because we all complain about the things that are wrong and the difficulties we face, but sometimes it takes a while. Sometimes it takes 50 years. But how delicious when you get to turn around and take your $3 million and say, you know what, the world does need to change, and we're going to make sure that it does. One final thing is that every one of the genius women who I interviewed had at least one person who believed in her. Sometimes it was a mentor, a teacher, a parent, and it wasn't that just generic, you go girl kind of belief. It was really recognizing the talents, the specific talents that they had. And my one hope is that all of you talented men and women who are listening to this today will be that inspiration for a young person, for a young woman, and will be able to inspire somebody to be the genius that she deserves to be. One final thing that I learned in writing this book is not to be self-deprecating and that women need to speak up for themselves. So please buy a copy of The Genius of Women. I think you will enjoy it. I hope you'll share it with friends. Buy a copy for your daughter, your next door neighbor who's a genius, and all of your friends. And both The Genius of Women and The Gratitude Diaries are out in paperback now, so it doesn't cost much. Thank you so much. I'm going to stop this screen and hope that I can rejoin Susan now and take some questions from Susan and from all of you. Susan, you're muted.
You know, that's the number one phrase of 2020. You're on mute. I'm going to give myself a little credit for having well read your book, because almost everything I had on my list of questions you covered in your PowerPoint. However, there were a few that were not in your PowerPoint that are of interest to me. So I'm going to start with one, which is you quote Plato in your book, and you say that Plato had said that what is honored in a country will be cultivated there. And then you give an interesting example of how the women of Southern Italy are good in math. Could you talk about that a little bit and explain that to the audience?
Sure. I encountered a woman professor. Again, I believe she was at University College London, and she was from a very small town in Italy. And yet she was a professor of physics at University College London. And we had a wonderful afternoon together. And she was talking about how what a sexist and tradition-bound community she was from. And I said to her, well, it's just amazing then that of all of the things you could have done, you became, your talent is in math and you're a professor of math and physics. And she looked at me in sort of surprise and she said, well, actually where I come from, it's expected that women will do well in math. And just my sister is in math, my cousins are in math, all of the women I know do well in math. And I was so taken aback by that because, again, we tend to think of these things as being inbred or natural. Who would ever think that you're good in math because you're in a social structure that expects you to be good in math? But there have been so many similar studies that have shown that. There's one study that was done where Asian girls, high school girls, were given a math test. And shortly before the math test, they were either reminded that they were Asian or they were reminded that they were girls. And they did significantly different depending on which they were reminded, because their stereotype is a girl isn't supposed to do well in math and an Asian is supposed to do well in math. And again, you should know how much 2 + 2 is, whatever you've just been reminded of. But what happens is you get to a sticky problem. And how hard are you going to work on it? How much effort are you going to give to it? Depending on what your expectation is for yourself, sometimes changes what your abilities are. So I love the idea that if I grew up in Southern Italy or in her little town, I might be much better at balancing my checkbook than I currently am.
Well, that's really interesting. And the fact that you mentioned Asia is something I wanted to ask you about as well. So not specifically in your book, but I was reminded of it because personally I had spent quite a bit of time over a period of years teaching in China. So I learned a little bit about the culture there. And I was reminded of it in your story about Ariel, the princess. Um, because you also describe her, in addition to being not able to speak and losing her voice, as being hobbled, unable to really stand on her own 2 feet, so to speak. Reminded me a little bit of the culture in China when they used to bind the women's feet so that they also couldn't really move well. And I wondered if there was any thought about that for you when you were writing this book, about how that exists in other cultures, not just in Disney cartoons,
Yeah.
actually in real life.
Well, and it's not just in China that we hobble women.
Yes, I just thought of that particular place, but yeah,
I used to wear high heels before the pandemic.
yeah.
Um, I have a whole chapter in the book, as you know, Susan, on beauty. And it was one of the more complicated issues that I dealt with, about how women in professions deal with how they're supposed to look. And the fact that no matter what they do, people pay attention to that, for good or not so good. And that women are constantly caught in a bind about that, right? If you're too pretty, then you're not completely taken seriously as a great physicist. And if you're not attractive and you pay no attention to how you look, then people are going to comment on that rather than listening to what you're presenting. And it's obviously a problem that women face far, far more than men do. And I had many of the women who I interviewed take different positions on that. I spoke to Cynthia Brazil, who I mentioned during the presentation, the roboticist at the MIT Media Lab. She's a very attractive woman in her 40s, I would guess, and she has 2 teenage sons, and she dresses quite sexily. And I've seen her do talks where she's wearing, over the knee boots and mini skirts. And she said all the people at MIT were always telling her, hey, you're a genius in artificial intelligence and in robotics. You should wear a hoodie. You should look more like, the guys in Silicon Valley. And her line to me was, I'm going to wear what I want to wear. And she said they should be able to look beyond the boots. So looking beyond the boots or the high heels or the Chinese round feet is a good idea, but I'm not sure that we're all always able to do it. Let me tell you the other side of that story, and why sometimes paying too much attention to how we look becomes a problem and does inhibit women. There was another study done by Barbara Fredrickson at the University of North Carolina some years ago. And similar to the story I told about the girls taking the math test, she gave women a math test, and her experiment was to have some of them try on a bathing suit before they took the test, while others tried on a sweater. Now, they weren't taking the test in a bathing suit. That would just be too horrific to even imagine, I'm sure, for most of us. But they simply tried on the bathing suit ahead of time. And they did significantly worse on the test. And her conclusion was that it made women focus and think about how they look. And that takes brain power, and that takes energy, and that takes emotional effort, and that takes away from whatever the other work is that you're trying to do. So those are sort of conflicting positions on it. And it's the only chapter where I didn't come to a complete conclusion, but I think it's a really important subject to ponder, and it was really fun for me, and I hope for readers to see both sides of that.
You do mention someone you interviewed who always wears some kind of a bright, colorful scarf. You mentioned she always makes herself somewhat noticeable by a distinguished piece of clothing.
Right.
Correct.
Named Monica Mandelli, who is she was a businesswoman. She was my genius businesswoman who I used the book, and she also happened. I only had 2 women from Italy in the book, but she also happened to be from Italy, and she talked about how when she first came to America, she had a very distinctive Italian accent, and she went to a voice coach to learn how to get rid of that accent and how to sound more American. And she's a very determined woman. And her husband found it quite odd that she was standing in front of the mirror saying these, these sentences. And then she had a coach at work, and the coach at work said to her, I've seen a study that says that Americans actually pay slightly more attention to people who have accents than to people who don't. And they'll give you, I don't remember what it was now, 10 seconds more attention before they discard you if you have an accent. And she said she suddenly realized, oh, maybe I should focus on the things that I am and expand who I am rather than trying to hide it. So yeah, I'm Italian. I have an accent. I'm flamboyant. I wear great clothes. So why don't I do just more of that? And she does. She wears great clothes and great jewelry. And she's also really, really smart. And I think I titled that chapter after her. It was something about, how it was kind of in a joking title of how to succeed by wearing flamboyant scarves. And I had sent her the chapter ahead of time to make sure that I had all the quotes correct. And she said, yes, everything was great. And she was honored to be in the book, but really she didn't want to be known only for her scarves. So could I rethink the chapter?
Yeah.
But I liked
Renamed it, renamed it. Yes, but I did like that. I know we have some questions from the audience, but I just have a couple more things I'd like to ask you to expound upon a little bit more. You talked quite a bit in your presentation about babies, but one of the stories I really liked and I would like to ask you to share is about the baby in the elevator, where someone kept asking you, what kind of baby is this? And you just you tell the story.
Yeah, I was on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, and I was holding, I don't remember now, maybe he was about 6 months old at the time. And he was in little overalls, but he was holding a pink sippy cup. And I was in the elevator, and this was pre-COVID, so you're allowed to have two people in the elevator. And we stopped and somebody else got in, and she said, oh, your baby. And then she said, is it a boy or a girl? And I was in the middle of writing this book. So I said brightly, it's a baby. And she said, boy or girl? And I said, 6 months old. And he didn't know how to respond, because we're so set on, if it's a girl baby, we say, oh, she's so beautiful. If it's a boy, we say, oh, he's so handsome or so strong, or look, we just, all of our language is based on whether we know the baby is a boy or a girl. And when we got to the lobby, I told, I apologized to the woman, and I told her that I was in the middle of writing this book about women and stereotypes and called The Genius of Women. And we had a lovely long conversation after that. And as I recall, she had 4 children. And she said she had always, as I've said about other people, she had always assumed that she was raising her children to be, in the same way, that she wasn't treating the boys and girls any differently. And she said it was really stunning to her what I had done, and how she had, realizing her own reactions. And I think we don't realize our own reactions because these things are buried so very deep. They're just such a part of what we do every day. And when we stop and think about them and we call ourselves out on them, or we call other people out on them in a gentle way, it can change how we think about possibilities.
Yeah. And I'm just going to ask you to expound upon one more thing a little bit more, and then I'll go to the audience questions. But I thought it was very significant that you discussed that every one of the genius women, certainly in the modern times that you were discussing, had this significant other supportive person. Because I think sometimes it's hard, to ask for help or to receive help. And I'd love to hear you expound a little bit more upon the fact that all of these women had someone that was in some way supporting their work.
Yeah, it wasn't even supporting their work, perhaps so much as believing in them. And I think one of the difficulties women have often is in believing in themselves and in having and that undermines work perhaps as much as anything else. I mentioned Meg Urey, who is the tenured professor of physics at Yale. By the way, Meg was the first tenured professor of physics at Yale. We're in 2021. I was writing this book 2 years ago. I cannot tell you how many people I interviewed who were the first in something. But Meg told me a story, and it's a little aside from Susan, but she told me a story about being at a meeting that was of tenured professors at Yale, women tenured professors at Yale. And because they were there for a particular reason, but because they didn't all know each other, she asked them all to go around the room and introduce themselves and say what they were an expert in. And so the first woman gave her name, and then she said, well, I'm not really an expert, but my field is. And the next woman also gave her name, and like the first said, well, yes, of course, I'm also not an expert, but I'm, my research is in. And Meg said she was infuriated. Being a tenured professor is by definition means that you're an expert. And the currency at any university is expertise. But women have so often learned not to believe in themselves and to undermine their own work and not to flaunt how talented they are. And we tend to put ourselves down before anybody else does. And so when you ask about a mentor or somebody who believes in you, I think it's often somebody like Meg Urey or like Frances Arnold, who I mentioned, who can say to a young person, you're terrific at what you do. You're great. And stop worrying about the people who tell you that you're not. The whole world is not going to support you. The whole world is not going to be behind you when you're a woman or a smart woman or a talented woman trying to make your way. But you need somebody who says to you, you're terrific. And that's all you need to know.
You do mention in that chapter, which is called Game-Changing Powers, the chapter of all the attributes of that the women have in common. But one of the things, I don't know if it was on the list, but it was one of my favorite, as you said, they all have this in common. They're not afraid of failure. I thought that was such an important characteristic.
Absolutely. There's a, so many of the women, you get the sense from the women I'm talking about that they're all these bold, powerful women, and they're not. These women all have different personalities. One who I interviewed is named Fei Li, who is, again, a young woman in her 40s, and she grew up in China, and she was very reserved and very quiet, and she's also one of the great geniuses in the world in artificial intelligence. And she has discovered a way for computers to see that pretty much revolutionized the way computers do see it. It's used in everything, including driverless cars now. And very different personality than Frances Arnold, but I had asked her the same question I asked Frances Arnold about how did you get the courage to do the work you did when everybody was telling you that this was too revolutionary and was unlikely to work. And she said, well, I thought about what they were saying. I didn't think they were right. And I thought, what's the worst that can happen? So I'm wrong, and then I'll go on to something else. But I might as well try what I believe in right now. And again, I thought that was a wonderful answer. What's the worst that can happen if you're wrong? What's the worst that can happen if you fail? So you go on to the next thing.
Yes,
and
I just thought that was terrific.
Having that confidence and giving that confidence to somebody, whatever their style and personality is, I think helps enormously.
So we do have a lot of questions, so I'm going to switch to the audience questions now. Are you ready? So the first one was, who was the woman in the front row with the Albert Einstein picture, the first picture you put up in your presentation?
Oh, bravo for having noticed. And the reason I use that image is because I always pointed out
Rosalind,
noticed that was Marie Curie. That was a gathering of great physicists, and that was Marie Curie in the front row.
And is it true that Mrs. Einstein actually figured out the theory of relativity, but he took the credit?
Well, I have a chapter in the book about Mrs. Einstein, and I hope you'll read it. We don't know exactly how much she contributed, certainly a fair amount, and there's great controversy about exactly how much. What I found fascinating about that whole controversy is that we understand that Einstein and other geniuses work with other people, that there are areas that have certain weaknesses in. Einstein had certain weaknesses actually in math. He was great in theoretical thinking, and he had a famous mathematician who he worked with on some of his things. We have no problem with that. But as soon as we think that maybe his wife helped him out, that his wife, who also was a brilliant physicist, might have contributed, people go crazy and get really upset about it. And I found that almost more interesting as I was doing the research than the actual question of how much she contributed. Just how Team Einstein versus team wife against each other.
Here's another question. Do you feel these advisories that you're explaining can be used when bias is against people of color?
It's a great question. And I didn't go into racial bias too much because I didn't think I was the person to write that book, and I hope somebody will. I did interview a woman named Carol Anderson, who is a professor, the head of the African American Studies Department at Emory University, and has written some wonderful books. And we met, and I was reading one of her books as when I interviewed her. And one of my first questions to her was, I said to her, I love your book. I'm so, it's so overwhelmingly wonderful. But I also noticed that in the first 10 pages, you have about 30 footnotes. And I wondered why that was. And she said, I'm a Black woman. I'm not allowed to get anything wrong. I get questioned on everything I do. I have to support every word I say. And I was really struck by that. She's a wonderful, cheerful, delightful woman, but she also knows that how people look at her. And she also knows that by being a woman of color, she is going to be doubted more than any other woman. And women are already doubted for their knowledge and abilities. So yes, sometimes women have to take those extra steps, and certainly women of color, it becomes compounded.
Here's another. Do you think that women who are asked what they do and are very professional not say so because they don't want others to think that they're bragging?
Well, it's back to that concept of, why is that bragging to say what you do? And are people really going to be threatened by your doing good work? Shouldn't they just be excited by it? And I think if women can feel good about what they do and not feel like, would we ever say a man is bragging if he says, I'm a partner at this law firm? We'd say, nice, okay, and where do you want to go for dinner? So why is it if a woman says that, it's a problem? And I think that, again, it's something that women do to themselves. I talked about women needing to do that great workaround often. And I think one of the workarounds that we do is to be self-deprecating and to put ourselves down and to make ourselves less than we are so that others won't be threatened by it. And all I can say is stop. It's not helpful.
But you do mention in the book that the concept of the patriarchy lives in us, even in things like and pulling out chairs and opening doors.
Right. There's a great sentence of it's not just that we live in a patriarchy, but the patriarchy lives in us. It's not just men who are causing these issues. Women have bought into it. Otherwise, the system wouldn't have lasted. And the system does work for some women. And I certainly can accept that and accept their views too. But it doesn't necessarily allow all of us to make the most of our talents. And by the way, a society that doesn't allow the talents of 50% of its population to emerge is not a society that's going to be able to continue. We can't do that as a country, as a population, and expect to continue to compete.
I'm finding some other questions in the chat, so I'm going to read them. Let's see. Here's one. Do you think, in addition to changing our bias toward gender roles for women, we need to change the biases we put on men?
Yes, absolutely. A fair question. And I think one of the things that we can do is to stop separating men and women so much. And I skipped over the part about male and female brains when I was doing the presentation, but one of the people I spoke to for that was a neuroscientist in Chicago. And she said that she thinks one of the dangerous things that we do is to decide that boys and girls have different talents and they're good in different things. And so we separate them out in classrooms. And I'm sure you've all seen with children or grandchildren that starting at about age 3, classes get very separated. It's the boys against the girls, or there's summer camp and the boys go to one camp and the girls go to another camp starting at these ridiculously early ages. And then we grow up and all of a sudden you're at that law firm or business or medical practice and you're
Mhm.
expected to treat men and women as colleagues. Well, you haven't grown up with that. You haven't grown up
Mhm.
learning that. So I think it's really important that boys and girls learn to treat each other as friends and colleagues from the time they're very young. And in fact, several of the people, the women who I interviewed, talked about how important that was in their lives. The woman actually who started 23andMe talked about how she grew up on the Stanford campus, and that all of her friends were boys, as you know, boys and girls were in their study groups together. It was a very liberal environment. And she said when she got to college was the first time she met somebody who made a derogatory comment to her about not being able to do something because she was a woman. And she said she almost looked at him as a sociological experiment. She said, "Oh, you're one of those people who think boys and girls are different. Isn't that interesting?" Well, you know, that's a great perspective to be able to have and a
Mhm.
great confidence to be able to have as you go off and start a company.
Wow. So we're sort of winding down on time, but I have one more question here, and then I'm going to ask you something myself. What advice, the questioner asked, would you give to young women who are just starting out in their path today?
Well, I think, first of all, make sure you marry the right person, because I think having a spouse or partner, I heard this over and over again from women who really see your career as important as theirs and are willing to make a 50-50 relationship is really
Mhm.
important. I think also take the words of Frances Arnold and do not doubt yourself. I think the
Mhm.
biggest problem young women have as they start out is they see all the obstacles and we hear all the problems. And look, we do need to make changes. And so discussing those problems is important, but it can start to overpower everything else. And the world can start to seem too dangerous and too scary. And if you think everybody's going to be against you and all men are going to be attacking you, then you might just choose to back off. Well, don't back off. Be yourself, be strong, and have the courage to go ahead and not worry about everything quite as much. And I think that that confidence and strength just builds more confidence and strength.
Mhm. So this has been very interesting. The book is very interesting and it's full of so much information and so many stories. So I don't know if this question I'm about to ask you in closing is possible, but if is there one message from your book that you would like all of us who are here today to take away?
Yeah, I think there are many messages in the book or many
Mhm.
ideas in the book. And again, I hope you'll all get a copy and share it. But I think one of the joys I had in writing the book is that towards the end, as word started getting out and people knew that I was doing this book, I was hearing from so many people and getting emails of people saying, "Oh, you know who you need to include? Ah, you know who you should put in this book?" And of course, I couldn't put everybody in the book, and I never intended to put everybody in the book. The book is about themes, not just individuals. But I think if this book allows you to open up your mind a little bit and to look at women differently and to think about women differently and to think about the woman next door and your sister and your friend and go, wow, yeah, she has lots of skills and talents that I haven't seen before or thought of before. And to think of yourself in a different way and to think of the possibilities that you have for yourself in a different way. I think then I would feel that the book has been a success.
Terrific. Well, it's been a great pleasure for me to have this conversation with you about the book and of course to read the book. And I think at this point, Karen, I'm going to turn it over to you for some
Yes.
closing words.
Thank you.
Thank you both so much. This has been a fascinating conversation. Janice, you've given us a lot to think about. And I think every young woman and man should read this book. So put it on your gift list for the young people in your life, and for all of the women in your life. You know, it makes a wonderful book gift, maybe for Mother's Day coming up. So on behalf of the Florida JCCs in Orlando, Boca, Fort Lauderdale, North Miami Beach, and Miami, thank you so much for joining us. And our next program will be right after Mother's Day on March 13th with two authors, Bess Kalb, who wrote the book, Nobody Will Tell You This But Me, A True Story, which recounts the life of her grandmother, and Derek Hertz, author of I Am My Mother's Daughter, Wisdom of Life, Loss, and Love. So once again, thank you, Janice Kaplan and Susan Gladstone Pasternack, for a fabulous conversation. For those that missed it, we did record it, so we will be sharing it again. And have a wonderful afternoon. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having us. Bye.